Hopefully, there we go, Pamela. If it wasn't recording before, hopefully we have it now. So for those of you on the recording, you haven't missed much, except for sparrows are cool. They're small to medium size. They're primarily seed eaters, especially when we see them in the winter. Throughout the breeding season, they'll eat fruit, insects, other invertebrates. You know, the overwhelming majority of songbirds eat insects during the breeding season, or at least find insects to feed their young. There aren't many birds that only eat seeds throughout the entirety of the year. And most are various shades of brown or gray. But there's a lot of variation. We birders have a lot of words for brown, from, buff and chestnut and ferruginous and ochre and all sorts of stuff. And the sparrows cover, the whole range of those colors. But they are frequently heavily patterned, bold head markings, bold wing stripes, streaking on their breast. So this is a very general picture of what a sparrow might be like. And so what about their taxonomic history, their evolutionary history, their relatedness to one another? So again, they're songbirds. They're in that large grouping of the Passeriformes. They are in the family of the New World sparrows, or the Passerellidae, which is around 130 plus species across the Americas. There's still some ambiguity about their history. Did they start off in the tropics and expand northward? Were they more of a northern grouping of birds that filled smaller niches in the tropics? The bird in the upper right is a rufous-collared sparrow, and you might be able to tell from its head pattern that it's a close relative. It's in the same genus as white-throated sparrow and white-crowned sparrow. And we know in that genus that the ancestor of those birds was actually a tropical species, and they expanded northward. So the rufous-collared sparrow is kind of holding down the fort where that genus started, and then the white-throat, the white-crown, the golden crown, and the Harrises kind of expanded northward to fill in those gaps. Despite the name, they are not closely related to the Old World sparrows. This includes house sparrow. So house sparrows are actually more like weaver birds than they are what we call sparrows. So it's very confusing. Our sparrows are more closely related to the Old World buntings and some finches, as well as the chat tanagers, which, unless you've been to the Dominican Republic or Haiti, you probably haven't seen or don't know much about. The one on the bottom right there, that photo, is an eastern chat tanager. They're only found on Hispaniola. So one day I hope to make it down there and get those two birds. They're in their own family. They're super unique. But anyways, these are the closely related families to the New World sparrows. But it is still kind of messy. They are part of this group called the New World 9 primaried oscines, which is a super technical term for this group. Pretty much there are a large grouping of birds in the New World, and by New World I mean the Americas, that have 9 primary feathers. And I'll show you in the next slide kind of what that looks like. And all of these birds combined make up around 10% of all the diversity on the planet. So this is primarily 6 major families: the finches, the cardinals, which include like the dickcissel and the grosbeak and even some tanagers. Then the quote unquote true tanagers, like what there's a lot of in the Central and South American tropics, our warblers and our blackbirds. So those 5 plus our New World sparrows are the majority of these 9 primaried oscines, which make up around 10% of all the birds on the planet. So there's a lot of uncertainty and mess around their evolutionary history, but it's becoming clearer and clearer, hopefully. And it seems like every couple of years there's a major shakeup to this stuff. But in general, just remember that there's New World sparrows, there's Old World sparrows, over 130 species here throughout North, Middle, and South America. So just to give a little more background on this technical stuff I'm throwing out, what is an oscine and a sub-oscine and all this stuff? This is just tangentially related to sparrows, but I figured I'd throw it in there. The oscines are more or less the songbirds, and they have a more developed syrinx and vocal cords. They can sing more. They can make multiple noises at the same time. And typically it's related to learned vocalization as well. So, our sparrows and our Baltimore Oriole, like the one on the top left, they learn their song during their development, and they can sing prettier songs. Where the sub-oscines, like the flycatchers, have a more primitive vocal system, more or less. And that's why a lot of our flycatchers are just giving little wit calls or 2-note little things. And it's an innate thing. So if you find a baby least flycatcher and you keep it in a cage, it will learn to make its vocalizations, or it will vocalize like any wild bird. But if you were to do that to a Baltimore Oriole, it would never sing exactly as it should, because some of it's learned and they have these more developed song systems. So anyways, I say all this because I mentioned that the sparrows are New World Oscine birds. And this is what I mean. They have a more developed vocal system. And when I talked about the 9 primary, this is the top view of a wing. Maybe Charlie Muse covered this back when you all were actively in Master Birder. But I want to show out in the light gray, you have P1 through P10. Those are the primaries, or the outermost flight feathers, which really help get the birds some propulsion as they go. And you can see they go from P1, or primary 1, out to P10. And in this graphic, the P10 is long. It's almost as big as a P9. But in the 9 primaried Oscines, which the New World sparrows are a part of, that P10 is either non-existent, or it's a little teeny thing that's only a couple millimeters long. So they're starting to lose, or they have been losing that feather. And there's all sorts of birds, like I mentioned, that are in that group, like the cardinals and the tanagers. So a bit technical, a bit more than we probably needed to know, but I think interesting, and it kind of tells you a little bit more about what makes one of our New World sparrows a New World sparrow. So we have these birds, or songbirds. They have a small 10th primary. They learn their song. They have this amazing vocal system. What else about them? What else do we know about their family, this Passerellidae? They cover a wide range of habitats. Now, many of them are a bit more open or simple in structure. So I think when I think of sparrows, I think of more grassland open habitat birds, but there are Arctic breeding sparrows, there are desert sparrows, there are birds from the tropical rainforest that are still in this larger family. In general, birds in the tropics in this group are larger, which is kind of interesting because in many species, it's the opposite. The further north you get, the larger an organism comes or becomes. But in tropical sparrows, like the bird in the upper right, which is called a city-capped chlorospingus, they're bigger than pretty much all of our sparrows that we have here in the States. In the States and in Canada and further north, sparrows tend to be browner, streakier, orange, grays, browns. And then when you go a bit further south, you get a lot more greens and grays and olives and blacks and typically less streaking. So these birds are kind of emblematic of a southern New World sparrow with the chlorospingus, and then a northern New World sparrow with the field sparrow down at the bottom, even though the field doesn't have much streaking. I remember learning that these chlorospingus and other things were actually sparrows. They used to be lumped with tanagers. So another example of the complicated history of these birds. So we're going to move away from all these cool tropical sparrows, which you should check out. There's orange-billed sparrow and the chlorospingus and all sorts of really wild stuff that look quite different than what we're used to seeing. But for our sparrows here in Georgia in the U.S., like I mentioned, they're generally birds of a more open country with structurally simple habitats like grasslands or wetlands. There aren't too many that are like deep forest breeding birds. A lot of them like the edge of habitats, or again, in the open spaces. They are cup nesters. So kind of what you imagine when you see a cardinal building a nest, or you think of a bird nest, they're weaving little blades of grass or other things together to make an open cup. Some of them are domed, and so they have a side entrance, but the majority are normal kind of cup nesters. Their young are altricial, and if you remember, that just means that they're kind of naked and helpless. Precocial or like geese, when they hatch and they can walk instantly and they follow their parents around the feed. Altricial means they're sitting there and they need to be cared upon by at least one of their parents until they're old enough to fledge and leave the nest. And while that varies a lot in sparrows, in general, it's 10 to 14 days for these birds to get out of the nest. With some birds, like white-throated sparrows, the ones that I know the most about, they would leave the nest as soon as 8 or 9 days after they hatch, which is pretty crazy. As you can tell from this photo, which is a grasshopper sparrow nest that I found years ago, frequently they're on the ground. And so they have really high rates of predation often, and many of them will brood multiple times because their success rates are kind of lower. So we're learning more and more about these birds. What about the physical adaptations that they have, again, that make them sparrows? They tend to have conical bills that allows them to break the seeds open that they need to get food from. Again, especially in the winter months when that's a really, really heavy component of their diet. A lot of them are kind of chunky, thick-necked, maybe a bit big-bellied like the towhee down there. They have rounded wings. And part of that is because they tend to be short distance migrants. If you think of birds like shorebirds or Arctic terns, they have really long pointed wings that allow them to really cover these great distances when they migrate. So wing shape is actually an indicator often of migration. And so song sparrows do shorter migrations, or excuse me, sparrows do shorter migrations. And so they tend to have rounder wings. We've talked a lot about their coloration, tans, browns, streaked. Many sparrows are monomorphic, meaning they look the same, males and females. So song sparrows, you can't tell the difference. White-throated sparrows, sometimes you can tell a difference. Towhees are, they break the rule there, with the females being that milk chocolate brown and the males being black. But in general, most sparrows, the males and females look the same. They have larger feet in relation to the body because they like to kick up and dig amongst the debris on the ground. And they move well in really dense habitats. And that makes sense because they're down lower, they're in these grassy areas and these brushy areas, and they need to be able to move well through the dense tangles that they might encounter. So where are we going to find sparrows? Again, it varies from Arctic to deserts to everywhere in between. But a lot of them are more prairie, open grassland birds. A couple of examples being the Henslow sparrow that I showed earlier, grasshopper sparrow, vesper sparrows. These birds tend to not like much woody vegetation, grasses and forbs and lower things. You'll see them jumping up on tall blades of grass and swinging, especially Henslow sparrows. They can be very mousy. A lot of field guides will say they have mouse-like behavior. And by that, they just mean they will often run or walk instead of flying. They're very skulky. They don't have much to hide in, or they can't fly up high to a tree. They're going to be down low. So they need to be good at ducking and dodging and diving all the predators that might be there. And because of that behavior, and because the conditions need to be right for a bird to be sitting up on top of the grass, these particular sparrows can be extra hard to detect, at least from my experience. Now, most species, I think, kind of fall into this habitat. They love kind of small woody growth, some grasses or wetland vegetation, a few trees mixed in. Some examples are song sparrows, linkins, white-throated, even field sparrows. Field sparrows love raspberry bunches and stuff like that. They love to toss leaves, get down in that leaf litter that now is present when you have some trees nearby. They're a bit more likely to come up. So a grasshopper sparrow, unless you see it on a fence as you drive through an agricultural area, they can be very hard to spot. But all these birds tend to sit up on a low branch and sing, or at the top of a bush. They're not quite as difficult to spot. So they come up higher in elevation. And knowing these slight habitat differences or preferences can make it easier for knowing what species to expect, or where you might need to look within the habitat to detect them. Marsh species are also really tricky because it's more or less just a different type of grassland habitat. Here in Georgia, we have some pretty great marsh sparrows, Seaside, Nelson, Salt Marsh, and even LeConte in some small numbers. They're very well adapted to these habitats. Seaside sparrows are incredibly camouflaged. If you ever go to the Georgia coast, we see one, they're the exact same color as our marsh muddy substrate. They have large feet that allow them to walk on the soft mud when they do get down that low, when it's lower tide. And a longer bill, they can even do it, not really probing, but they can dig down in the substrate a bit. So like the grassland birds, they come up at the tops of grass stems on occasion, especially during high tide. So if you ever want to go to the coast, or if you're on the coast and you want to find these birds, your best bet is at the highest tide you can possibly find. then go look for them. Because if not, they're going to sit down low, keep themselves covered up, and it's a real challenge to get good looks. So those are just three kind of broad habitat categories where you do find sparrows a lot. Kind of grasslands, marshy edges or marsh grasslands, and then edge habitat, early successional type areas. Now, what are the general distributions of sparrows across the U.S.? There are many that are kind of generalist in that you find nationwide. Song sparrow comes to mind. But then there are some that are hyper specific to either a habitat type or an extremely small ecological niche. So some of them are more eastern, like the field sparrow, which is the map on the left. If you can imagine the geography and geology and climate of our country, you have all that moisture coming off the Pacific, the Rockies suck it all out, and then you have the deserts. And then as it starts to get a little bit wet and grassy again, that's when you start seeing field sparrows. And a lot of birds kind of have that similar, eastern distribution once you start getting into the healthy prairies and grasslands and then into the eastern deciduous forest. A lot of the ones that are heavily grassland dependent, they're more restricted to the central flyway or central parts of our country, like the LeConte sparrow in the map on the right. You can see they migrate in the yellow, migrate primarily through the central part of our country. Baird sparrow is another one that does that. There are many other kind of central grassland prairie species. Of course, for the marsh birds, they're going to be on the coast almost exclusively. And then a super narrow one would be our Bachman sparrow that we have here in Georgia. They're pretty much only in longleaf pine forests. You might be able to get them in some other pine habitat, but they're a really good indicator of healthy pine and healthy longleaf forest. And they're often one of the first birds to come back after a burn, after there's fire in that habitat. So as with all this, there's a lot of variation across these species, but in general, most of the birds we have in Georgia are either nationwide or kind of eastern, and some being a bit more specialized. Now, regarding migration, we mentioned this, or I mentioned it a little bit a few slides ago. Most of them are migratory, but most of them are short distance migrants. I was just saying, again, in Costa Rica, we saw all these warblers, we saw tanagers, we saw songbirds. We didn't see any migratory sparrows. Very, very few of them leave the US, and even fewer go south of Mexico. Grasshopper sparrows will go into Central America a little bit, but in general, you're getting birds going from Canada down to the Midwest, or from the Midwest down to the Southeast. So there is still a migration of, a couple hundred or thousands of miles, but not these amazing journeys that I think most of us think of when we think of bird migration. There's even some examples I put here, like northern birds replacing southern birds. So, again, I'm going to use white-throated sparrow a lot just because I know more about them. They nest in, central New York, and those birds will leave, but then birds from way up far north in Canada will overwinter in New York. So there's a bit of a replacement, even though there's white-throated sparrows year-round in New York, they're not the same individuals. And there are some examples, again, with white-throats where males might overwinter further north than females, the theory being they can get back quicker to the breeding grounds to kind of claim their territory. Sometimes older and younger birds might segregate themselves differently or migrate to different locations. But in general, our sparrows are migratory. Even here in Georgia, like song sparrow. If you're down in the coastal plain or on the coast, you probably have song sparrows in the winter, but they're not going to be nesting there, which is something I was unaware of until I moved to Georgia. So they are migratory, just not as big as some others. So this is an older eBird map of the Savannah sparrow, just showing you that they have this large national distribution, but it's pretty dynamic and they're definitely migrating. So this is now the fall migratory season. You can see all those birds coming south. We have a lot of them in Georgia, especially the southern half. And then here's the beginning of the year, tons of them in Texas, and they're about to migrate up north. And then throughout the breeding season, we have them mainly up in the prairie pothole regions and upper Midwest and then throughout Canada. This one is the grasshopper sparrow. So again, I said they primarily leave the US, then they come blasting back through. They breed further south. than the savanna sparrows, and especially in the central flyway. And then again, they primarily head south. They don't show any here, but there are some overwintering birds in Georgia and definitely in Florida. But in general, they're heading down to Mexico. They really like it down there and a little bit further south. So again, a different migratory tactic for a different sparrow. Here's another one with the white-throated sparrow. They're all over the place here in the winter. And then it looks like they completely disappear because they're a boreal forest breeder. So there's only a couple spots in northern Minnesota and New England where these birds breed. And then they come and spend the more temperate climate here in the Southeast and in the Midwest. And these are some fun newer maps. Let's see how you move that in, have this on autoplay. This is some new species abundance data that eBird's put out. This is for the lark sparrow, a bird that we get annually in Georgia, but in pretty small numbers. You can see they're primarily a Western bird and one of these birds that does migrate south of the U.S. down to Mexico primarily. There's normally a couple pairs a year that breed in Georgia. Last year, I know some of you went and saw the ones that nested up in Bartow County, close to where we're going to go on our field trip. So they are around, and especially in winter, you can get them in South Georgia. Excuse my dog if you can hear him whining in the background. And then one more cool map, just because I'm a sucker for these. This is the field sparrow, which again is a pretty complete eastern distributed species. They don't migrate far, as you can see. Some are year round, some just migrate up a couple hundred miles. But I show you all that, A, because the maps are cool, and B, because just to show the diversity of the different migratory tactics that our New World sparrows take advantage of. This is even a cool one with field sparrows. These are a bit hard to read, honestly, in my opinion, but they're pretty neat about how the habitat association can change for a species throughout the year. So left to right is the month, and then each color is a different habitat type. And then the higher that color goes up, the higher abundance. So in other words, woody savannas are a good spot to find field sparrows throughout the year. But then you can see they go into more forested habitats, or croplands is kind of that salmony color. And some habitats are just never that suitable for these birds. Of course, deep ocean is one of those. But it's neat to look at these and see how when these birds do migrate, it might change what habitats they're in. This is a non-sparrow example, but if you think of like palm warblers, in the breeding season, they're in these beautiful boreal bogs and wetland type areas. And then in the winter, they're hanging out on palm trees and, scrubby habitat down in Florida in the Southeast. So a cool thing to check out. So in addition to all that migratory behavior that we just looked at, some other behavioral characteristics that sparrows demonstrate, almost all of them are territorial. They're going to have a pair during the breeding season. They're going to defend their patch of forest or grassland and have their nest in that little home range that they have. But in the winter, especially those that migrate, they form these flocks. They're a bit more gregarious. You can get larger flocks. There's safety in numbers. You can find food that way. Sparrows are pretty vocal even in the winter, especially with their chipping. They might not be singing quite as much, but so territorial in the breeding season, they loosen that up in the winter. They're primarily monogamous, so you normally get a male and a female with their nest on their territory. But we're learning more and more about there's extra pair copulations, or they might be mating with neighbors or other birds, even though they're socially monogamous. So it's a bit of a mix, but in general, there's a pair on a territory throughout the breeding season. One thing away from their breeding behavior that I always like to point out, especially with birds like this one in the photo, which is a Vesper sparrow. It's a Vesper sparrow. It's got that big white eye ring. You can see the white in the outer tail feather. We'll talk more about that on Thursday, but those are some of the key features that tell me it's a Vesper sparrow. How birds flush can really help. Where they perch when they flush, how far they fly. Some will linger more than others. Vesper sparrows, in my experience in Georgia, are often on the ground with savanna sparrows. But when they flush, if you do it on purpose or on accident, savanna sparrows normally fly low and they fly far and they drop back down in the grass, and they're really hard to see. Vesper sparrows almost always fly up to a bush or a tree and give you a good look. So sometimes if I'm walking, like for those of you who will be with me at Sam Smith Park this weekend, when we flush a group of birds off the ground, I'll be looking for the couple that might go up to a tree because it's much more likely to be a Vesper sparrow than a Savannah. Not 100%, but it's definitely a good little tip that I forget who I learned it from or when I picked it up, but it does help when I'm looking specifically for a Vesper sparrow. And when they flush, minor differences can often tell you what's unique and what's not the most common species there. So that's a lot of cool stuff, hopefully, on what makes a sparrow, where they hang out, how they behave, what they eat, kind of how they have their little territories. Why are you all here? Why do you find sparrows so hard? One of my favorite images is a similar one to this, where it has the Empidonax flycatchers and every single head is identical. So they're at least in this one, there are some different colors and patterns and things. But sparrows are hard. They are these little brown jobs that everyone says they are. Staying low, which is what I said is a benefit of sparrows. It's also a challenge because if they don't come out, that can be really tricky. They tend to be a bit skittish. I think that's probably because, again, they're low. They have really high predation rates, especially during the nesting season. So they need to not linger too much. Because many of them like more simple habitats, they don't often perch up for a long time. It's not easy to do on a blade of grass or something like that. So they tend to give you fleeting looks. So you got to figure out the identification sometimes pretty quick. And, when it's windy, it's never good for almost any birding, or it can be challenging. But for grasslands, it's really hard. If you want to go see a grasshopper sparrow or something like that when it's windy, those birds are just not going to perch up, and it's going to be really difficult because of the conditions. So the wind and other factors can make it real challenging. In general, they are, or there is some truth in this skulky brown bird stereotype that these birds have. And here's an example that I'm sure many of you have encountered. Oh, there's a sparrow in there. It's on the backside of this bush. I can barely see half the face and a little bit of the belly. What is it? And you can't always tell, or you got to really stick with them and try to guess where they're going to move. So in addition to being on the ground and in grasses walking and all that stuff, their plumage, while unique, there are a lot of shared characteristics. Many sparrows have a streaked breast like these two birds. Many of them have a striped crown of some sort. And again, these can all help you in identification, but it can make it a bit challenging. It's like, oh, it's one of the 12 sparrows that has a streaked head. How does that help me? A lot of rufous or brown caps. Sometimes they're lacking these key characteristics that they get their name. And something that I always try to point out is that plumage can be really unreliable. Time of year, health of the bird, even the lighting, those things can throw off some of the big things you're looking for. And so I always try to preach a more holistic approach to your identification, which comes with some practice. And as I've mentioned a few times, they are brown. They are tan, they are gray. It's hard to rely on one thing that's a slam dunk, like, oh, that red tanager has black wings. It's a scarlet. We don't always get that with sparrows. They're small, they're fast, they're darty. And so you got to be quick, and you can only be quick with some practice, which hopefully we're going to work towards. So I put this photo in, but it's also, I'm really cheating because it's a young bird, and young birds are always hard, especially sparrows. But this bird would confuse almost anyone looking at it. It's a young song sparrow. But again, it's down low, it's brown, it's got a thick beak. There's not a whole lot going on. But I added this one because this is a bit more of a fair example. This is a swamp sparrow, but if you only saw the head, it's like, okay, it's got a striped head and it's got a pale throat and it's got a little bit of yellow in front of the eye. That could be a white-throated sparrow. Or are those streaks, or is it not streaky enough in the breast? Could that be a song sparrow? The structure looks right. So even for a bird that, in this example, you're seeing pretty well, they can still be a challenge because there are so many shared traits and so much variation amongst individuals. And speaking of that variability amongst species, there can be a lot. So the upper right image, luckily, we're not going to have to deal with this ever at one location, but all of those birds are song sparrows, as are the two living birds in the bottom. But you can see the ones up in Alaska and parts of Canada, they're 1.5 times the size of the birds that we're getting in the eastern US. There's a lot of geographic variation within species. Song sparrows, again, being the prime example, they have around 23 to 25 unique subspecies. So there's a lot going on among song sparrows. And it's pretty cool if you travel out west and look for them. Their songs are a bit different. Everything's a bit different. You can see the markings on their belly, the kind of nature of their streaking, the colors and thickness of their throat markings. There's a lot within a species, let alone between species. Even savanna sparrows, I think most people, when they look at a savanna sparrow, they're looking for that yellow spot in front of the eye, which 90+% of the time is good. You're going to get birds on the left. But there are some that really don't have much yellow, like the bird in the middle. And then I'm being a bit unfair, but the bird on the right is the Ipswich subspecies, which mainly are up in the upper New England, North Atlantic coast. But there are a couple records from down here in Georgia. So these are all the same species. And while they are all pale, thin streaking in the chest, a little bit of white around the eye, they vary quite a bit in the color, the amount of yellow, the nature of the streaking. There's a lot going on there. And they can be very similar. The upper left bird is a Lincoln sparrow, but if you look down to the white-throated sparrow below it, they both have those thin markings. They both have a little bit of that tan buffy color. They both have head striping. They're not that different. Even the swamp sparrow on the top right and the white crowned, they're pretty distinct, but again, they don't have much streaking. They both have that kind of chestnutty reddish brown in the crown. A lot of sparrows do have similar characteristics. However, they can be pretty bold and flashy too. So this is a beautiful white-throated sparrow, probably a white morph male, which again, we're going to talk about on Thursday. But bright white, jet black, bright yellow. If you get a bird that looks like that, you're not going to mistake it for anything else. Nelson sparrows, they have one of the prettiest orangey colors. I just love the colors of these birds. Nelson sparrows, there's an interior central US population and a coastal one. We get both down here in Georgia. Mainly we get the coastal ones, but the ones in the Midwest have this just beautiful, rich orange color. And even the Henslow sparrows, which is tough to get a good look like this, but they have that amazing ochre olive in the head. They almost have like a purpley gray, fringe to their feathers. So they're not all drab, rufous brown birds. There's a lot going on if you put in the effort to get a good look, like this person got of this particular bird. All right. So we got these little brown jobs that really aren't little brown jobs. They eat insects and seeds and whatnot. They're down low. They're short distance migrants. What do we have here in Georgia? So all time, we've had 27 different sparrows that have been found in the state. 21 I am calling regular, though a few of those are very tough. There are 15 different genuses or genera that they're in. So for example, song sparrows, those are the Melospiza, and the white-throated sparrows are the Zonotrichia. And in Georgia, we do have breeding birds, but late fall and early spring migration is kind of the peak of our diversity. And we have more birds that overwinter here than we do that nest here. So what is the breakdown of those species that we see the most? So the left column are birds that are the breeders in our state. The little asterisks by them are those that have a extremely narrow geographic distribution in the state or a habitat. So we already talked about Bachman sparrows. They need longleaf pine forest. The dark-eyed junco, a common winter resident here, but they do breed up in Brasstown Bald and our higher peaks in the mountains. And then seaside sparrow, of course, are only going to be in healthy coastal marshes. The other birds you can find breeding pretty easily throughout the state, depending on where you look. Clay-colored lark and Lincoln sparrows in general are just migrants, but there are Lincolns. All those birds will overwinter here. And as I mentioned, lark sparrows have been nesting here in recent years. So they're not perfect in that in-between category. And then on the right, those are birds that are just here during the winter months. even Savannah sparrow, which was named after the city of Savannah, where the type specimen was described when it was captured there. But we have a lot of those prairie breeding sparrows like Henslows and LeContes and Vespers that come down. And we have a lot of those coastal ones, Salt Marsh and Nelsons as well. That spend the winter here. So any time of year is a good sparrow time in Georgia, but especially winter and early migration. We do get our vagrants. Lark bunting on the left. There's been a few of those over the years. There was one a couple years ago. It wasn't a handsome adult male like this black one on the left, but it was at Centennial Olympic Park right in the heart of Atlanta. But there's been a few others. Green-tailed towhee, a western bird. There's a couple records, I think, of those. And since Susan is part of the chat here today, this was one of the few updates I had to make since I last gave this presentation. We now have Baird sparrow on our list. This is my not very good photo of the one that showed up in North Fulton County last year. First state record. This is a bird of the prairies. Most people have to go to the Dakotas or to central Canada to see this bird. They overwinter in North Mexico. And one of them somehow made it to Garrard's Landing in Fulton County. So a cool addition to our Georgia sparrow list from last year.
Thank you for featuring that bird.
Of course, yeah. If I wasn't putting it in so last minute, I would have asked for one of your photos instead of mine, but I hit the easy button and threw in my photo. But yeah, Baird sparrow, very interesting. So this whole time I've been talking about taxonomy and behavior and what they're eating and when they're going to be here. And I say all that because I always preach that knowing as much as you can about the ecology and the behavior and the distribution of these birds is going to make your birding experience better and increase your chances of finding and then identifying the sparrows you're looking for if you have a target when you go out. If you remember from this or with a little experience, like, oh, I'm pretty sure white-throated sparrows are only here in the breeding or in the winter, then it's probably not what I'm doing in my yard. Or I remember that grasshopper sparrows are primarily in ag land and grasslands. It's probably not what I'm seeing up in, Ivy Gap Log Road up in North Georgia, or, thinking about what the bird is doing, how it's doing it, its general shape and structure, exactly where it is can really eliminate a lot of the confusion from my experience. The only difficulty is a lot of this stuff comes with practice outside. You can definitely read up on some of it, but from my experience, little by little, you'll start to pick up some of these things and go out with other birders or listen to when certain people are seeing certain things in certain places. And if you're not going with other people, or even in addition to that, I'm a big eBird component. It's not for everyone. I don't think people should feel pressured to use it, but it is great data. And even if you're not a big eBirder, you can still take advantage of all the interesting sightings that are there. So if you're saying, hey, Adam showed me that really cool picture of, a LeConte sparrow. Where do I go find a LeConte sparrow, and when do I go look for it? This is just looking at a portion of the sparrows that can be found in Georgia in March. The taller the bar, the higher percentage of checklists with that species during that time. So you can see LeConte's is always pretty uncommon, very, very thin. Same with Nelson's and Salt Marsh, compared to like a white-throated sparrow or a dark-eyed junco. But you can then type it in and go, okay, well, where are Nelson sparrows in March? And even though they're possible inland, like you see this bird over here on the border with Alabama, we mainly get them on the coast. And then you can zoom in and be like, okay, looks like some of the marshy habitat around Brunswick, the causeway out to Jekyll Island, some of the barrier islands up by Tybee, those are the places I should go look if I'm looking for a Nelson sparrow. And I remember that Adam said they're mainly in marshes and they like to hang out kind of low. Those things hopefully will make your sparrowing a bit easier. And in addition to that, just learning these habitat associations. Chipping sparrows like more open areas with big trees, but they're also really good at hanging out in our front yard And if you have a grassy patch with a nice big pine tree, you typically have chipping sparrows. They often nest on the low branches of pines. If you have them in your yard and you're looking for your nest, that's where you can find them sometimes. I've already mentioned grasshopper sparrows love ag fields and kind of very low greenery, bare soil. Swamp sparrows, as you might expect, they like wet spaces, the edges of wetlands and the grassy area. And then Vesper sparrows, they like those open habitats, like I mentioned, sandy soils, short grass, but they do like to fly up to those scattered trees or bushes. So, Savannah sparrows you'll get in a complete open grassy area, as will Vespers, but Vespers normally like there to be a tree or two nearby that they can perch in. Okay, so we're going to get in here a little bit into the identification just with the last, 5 or 10 minutes here. One thing that is helpful but also frustrating is, the sparrows are often the image in a field guide that teaches you all the parts of the bird. So, here you can see about the lore and the orbital feathers and the supercilium, which is kind of just like the eyebrow, or the malar marking, kind of what gives that Fu Manchu look of a song sparrow. So it's frustrating because there's maybe a lot of parts you need to remember, but it will make you more familiar with those feather tracks and bare parts and whatnot. I see your question, Abby. I'll get to it in just a second. One thing, as I mentioned earlier, anytime you can kind of go with the general structure and shape of a bird rather than a single feature, that's going to help you just in case you don't get a good look or anything like that. Devaluing plumage, but not ignoring it is helpful because, again, lighting, the age or the sex of the bird, the condition it's in, if it's molting. We have a lot of birds, a lot of sparrows that overwinter in Georgia. And so come April into early May, things like swamp sparrows and white-throated sparrows will molt their head. So you'll get these really ratty looking birds that might throw you for a loop. But they do that molting here before they migrate. I always like it because, late April, early May, you start seeing some swamp sparrows like this bird on the right. This is still in the winter plumage. They get that beautiful, bright, kind of rusty cap. It's a very small window, but I enjoy it. But again, I'm a pretty big bird and sparrow nerd, but it's a cool thing to look for. Late April, start to notice if your common backyard winter sparrows are starting to change their look a little bit. I tried to find where I pulled this from because, again, I want to focus on the shape and structure, but I also understand how little these silhouettes actually provide much help. But you can see some things about tail length or how the wing shape or the slope of the forehead. The Amodromus sparrows or Amodromus, the bottom left, they're kind of flat-headed. They don't have much of a round look to their head. That's the grasshopper sparrow. But again, shape and structure is important, even if this particular set of images does not show how helpful it can be. Okay, so the last thing we're going to touch on for this first part is what I think is the most important thing. And when Mark and I were chatting earlier, if you happen to come in, he kind of touched on it a little bit. But I think the best tip for you all is to really, really crush the song sparrow. Learn it as best as you can, understand its variations, understand the main features, and then go from there. And why I think that is because it's common. You can find it in various habitats, so it can confuse you in many ways. You can have in your front yard. You can also have it out at a nice wetland area. It can be very tricky because they're found everywhere, kind of, sort of. They're a little less secretive than most other sparrows, so they tend to give you a good look where you can really study and practice and understand the parts. They're vocal. They're year-round, at least in the northern, half of our state. And for me, if you can just start looking and be like, okay, when a bunch of sparrows fly away, those feel normal, which to me would equate, oh, that's a song sparrow. To then something's like, oh, that felt different, or that color was a little different, or that brown wasn't quite right. And then it'll give you something to focus on when you're trying to separate these wintering flocks of sparrows. So song sparrows can just be tricky enough, and they have so many of those generic features of sparrows that I think if you can really get comfortable with them, it will at least point you in the direction when you have something else, which is often what we're trying to get to. We talked about the subspecies. This doesn't matter too much because birds like the bottom left don't occur in Georgia. The top two birds is more or less what we're going to see most of the time. But again, there's variation amongst song sparrows. So what are we looking at? What makes a song sparrow a song sparrow? They're medium to large sparrows, bigger than chipping and field, but not as big as a fox or a towhee. A bit stocky. They're not real tall and thin. They're a bit more round. The main thing is they're heavily streaked on their breast and down their flanks on the side. I forget where I stole this from, and I know that I say it on most of my master birder field trips when we see song sparrows, but it looks like someone drew their markings oftentimes with crayon. They tend to be a little bit messy. They tend to bleed together. They tend to be wider compared to some other birds that we're going to talk about on Thursday. The head is an alternating kind of reddish brown and light gray on their head. They have a post-ocular stripe, which just means a line that comes just out of the backside of the eye, which you can see on this bird is kind of a thinner round line. And that is always going to contrast with the gray that's right above it. They have a paler throat and a malar, but then they have those dark lines, which give it that kind of mustached Fu Manchu look down below. And they're reddish in the tail and the wings, gray and brown in the back. Their tail is rounded. So I mentioned a lot of sparrows have rounded wings. These ones also have a round tail, which is helpful because Savannah sparrows have a lot of similar traits, but they have a notched tail, which again, we'll talk about that on Thursday. But the streaking on the chest, that brownish and gray striped head, the postocular line, those are a lot of things that are going to help you figure out a song sparrow. And I'm guessing most of you are pretty familiar with song sparrows at this point, but again, it can't hurt to feel 100% confident with a song sparrow. The other thing they have, which a lot of people key in on, is that center breast spot, that pin, stick pin, or the kind of the convergence of all the streaking on the chest. These birds are quite different in their streaking, but they both still have that center spot. And that is good. There are only a few other birds that we're going to see here in Georgia that might have that center breast spot. Like many birds, or like many sparrows, they're on the ground, but they will perch up in those bushes. They like some vegetation. They'll come to your feeders, or they'll hang out below and eat all the mess that the other birds have made. They're another bird that you can pish out pretty easy. So again, if you have a bunch of sparrows in general are pretty good at that. If you kind of pish, they'll come to you most times, with song sparrows being some of the most responsive. And one thing that's helpful is, to me, they look very clunky in flight. Their tail often doesn't come up. It looks like they're dragging it, and they tend to do shorter flights. So again, using Savannah sparrow as an example, of a Savannah and a song are both flying, Savannahs tend to do long flights. Song sparrows tend to do short ones. Their vocalizations, just like their plumage, is highly variable. But in general, there's a couple clear whistles at the beginning, followed by a trilling noise, and then kind of a buzzy crumble after that. On the right here, again, we're looking at all the different song species or subspecies. Those are all sonograms of song sparrow vocalizations. So again, even without knowing much about sonograms, you can probably tell they're highly variable. Here's kind of a generic song. So again, normally a kind of a cheery song with a couple clean whistles, then often a trill and some buzzy notes. But again, like I keep saying, unfortunately, they're quite variable. One thing that's really, really helpful for me, because I know chip notes or contact calls, which we call them, are not easy for people to identify birds, but song sparrows have a pretty distinct one. That call you're hearing there. A lot of books would call it like a jimp or a chimp sound. They have another call that they give us, that real generic chip, 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 that's a bit higher pitched. And white-throated sparrows give a very similar call, and white-crowned sparrows do. And it's hard to identify the species that higher, cleaner chip note that you'll hear. But almost always, from my experience, a song sparrow will do that high-pitched note a couple times, and then it goes to this chimp type call, which is diagnostic. So I know birding by ear is tough, but that call is really helpful, especially if you can't quite get the sparrow to come out of the bush that's down below you. Their range, we've talked about it with all their subspecies. They're across our entire country, but they breed a bit further north. You can see in Georgia on the far right, the red is the density of their breeding locations from the breeding bird survey. So they breed throughout middle Georgia, then in higher numbers up in the mountains. And then when you get up in the Midwest and into Canada, there's a high breeding density, but they overwinter throughout the rest of the country. I already mentioned this earlier with the book. If you were here at the beginning, this is a book that it's got to be 10 or 15 years old now, I would assume, if not older. But I was referencing it again today because I knew I pulled from it before for this presentation. And embarrassingly, I have not read Watership Down. Hopefully some of you are a bit better read than I am. But Bill Thompson, the author, points out how the rabbits in that book can only identify two types of birds, hawks and non-hawks. And that's where I want us to get with song sparrows. Song sparrow or a non-song sparrow. Again, there are some slam dunks like towhees and chipping sparrows that are very different, but with all the streaky sparrows out there, eliminating song sparrow is really helpful, and I think will make your identification easier, and it will draw you to those features that often make identifying a sparrow easier. And one thing that I used to and still have to tell myself at times, that Bill mentions in this book, is that when you see something, you're like, oh, that's something good. Don't panic and look at your bird book, or don't panic and look at Merlin. Digest the bird as much as you can, and then reference those sort resources once the bird's gone. So finally, I would approach this bird, okay, if I was still learning, why isn't this a song sparrow? It's not, but why isn't it? You go, oh, okay, the streaking is a little different. It's not quite as thick and crayony. There's also that tan color across the breast. I don't recall song sparrows having that. Oh, that Mallow region, the Fu Manchu, it's not whitish gray, and it's not quite as thick as I recall from a song sparrow. I don't see the center spot. You kind of do actually in this one, even though it shouldn't. It's just a mess in the feathers. But again, the background color, the nature of the streaking, the tanniness in the throat, the tanny circle around the eye, those are all non-song sparrow features. Now, again, this bird has a gray and rufusy striped cap like a song sparrow. It's up on a branch like a song sparrow, but those other features will point you to a Lincoln sparrow, which is what we have here. So to get us out of here, only a minute over in time, sparrows are tough, but they're beautiful, they're diverse, they're fun. They have subtle features that I think are a great challenge to try to tease apart. And then once you get them, you know, they can really come to easily. As much as you can learn about the families, their behaviors, what they eat, how they behave, where they migrate, it makes everything else so much easier. Really master the song sparrow with some practice. And of course, the more we can get outside, the better for every aspect of our birding, but especially sparrows. And this is one of the very few LeConte sparrows that I've seen in Georgia. Really gorgeous bird, really tricky to pin down. This was down at a private property south of Atlanta and near Sharpsburg. But these birds, it's hard to get them up in a tree like this or a little bush. You can maybe tell in the background, it was nothing but fields of grass. And we were walking in the grass and it flushed up to this tree, which was super, super helpful. So again, hopefully this is a detailed, excuse my dog, sorry. Hopefully this is a very detailed but helpful background of what makes a sparrow and what makes a song sparrow. And on Thursday, we'll kind of just do what we did with the song sparrow, but with 15 or 20 other birds that we have here across Georgia. Yes. Okay. So Barbara asked a good question, which I'll get to a little bit at the end of next time, kind of how are we sure we even have a sparrow? At the end of my on Thursdays, I'll show purple finch and red-winged blackbird, because it is challenging to even get to a sparrow. Let me see if I can, hopefully this doesn't give you a headache, and I'll jump back to the beginning a little bit. And to answer Abby's question while I do this, what are some of my favorite in-town sparrow spots? So two of them, which are kind of pushing it if they're in town, are the two that we're going on our field trips. So Bartow County is great because, again, you can get 10 to 12 species on a good day. And there's a nice mix of scrubby habitat and open area. Caldy Creek, those of you going with Nathan, they've had great sparrows there this winter. He's going to He's amazing in the field. He's going to find all sorts of good stuff for you. Pole Bridge has limited access. It's over in the DeKalb County, close to the Rockdale line, right on the South River. That area, if you can get in, often has really good sparrows. You know, a spot that since I've been here has pulled in a lot of good sparrows is Piedmont Park, especially what I'm not sure if it's been paved at all yet, but you know what will be or what is part of the belt line, the gravel trail going kind of up to the northeast corner. I know that I've personally seen lark sparrow there. I've seen white crown sparrow there. I've seen some other uncommon ones coming through. I haven't birded enough at the new West Side Park, but I've seen really cool sightings coming out of there. So that comes to mind. I'll think of some more, but those are the first few places that immediately come up. Oh yeah, Barbara also mentioned the DeKalb Farmers Market. I know my colleague Melanie has had good sparrows there in the winter, Vesper, white crowned. Oftentimes, you know, Abby, who asked me this question, she's on my in-town Christmas bird count team, and we go to just a grassy field at Metro Atlanta State College or whatever it is, right off of 75, and we've gotten nothing crazy, but we've had chipping in field and Savannah, and you know. That's I guess another exciting thing about sparrows. Any sort of dingy, overgrown little grassy patch could have something good. Adam, the answer to your question, that bright orange sparrow, yes, was a Nelson sparrow, and I forget the name of it, but I'm 99% sure it's the more central breeding subspecies. It might be Nelson I is the subspecies. The ones on the coast tend to be a bit drabber. Maybe that has to do with the vegetation that they hide in. And then Barbara, again, we'll go into detail on Thursday at the end. But it's a combination of the conical shaped bill. You know, some birds have that, but often like the grosbeaks and the finches, they tend to be even a bit taller and rounder and not as much of a cone shape. The blackbirds that are kind of tricky, like a female redwing, they tend to be more pointy. So the beak shape with some practice is helpful. The size, in general, sparrows are a touch bigger than most of the finches, but they're smaller than like the grosbeaks and the blackbirds. The streakiness can help. It can also hurt. So there definitely is some overlap on some other types of birds with those characteristics. Many of the other ones might be up in trees, which doesn't eliminate sparrows, but it often kind of does, because a lot of sparrows are kind of, 10 feet above the ground down to the ground, where a female rose-breasted grosbeak or a female purple finch, which kind of look like sparrows, they're normally going to be much higher. But there are definitely going to be times where you're going to have, a group of sparrows, and then mixed in might be a female indigo bunting or a female house finch, which can definitely look like a sparrow with their browns and grays and their streaks. So hopefully we'll talk more about that on Thursday, and I can clear up any confusion with the non sparrows out there. Any other questions before we call it an evening? So again, the plan for Thursday will just do a lot more of a deep dive on the, again, 15 or 20 or so most common sparrows we have in Georgia, and their key characteristics and how to tell apart similar species. Okay. Thank you all so much. Hopefully this is helpful. Yeah, you're very welcome. And
Thank you.
a more detailed breakdown of the species on Thursday.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Enjoy your evening. Bye, everyone.